This cybersecurity risk assessment for nations behaving badly, Project 2, Step 7, is contribution by Group 1, Team United States. This presentation covers cybersecurity risk assessments from a U.S. perspective with emphasis on approaches for identifying and managing risks, particularly while at the summit. The agenda. During this brief, we will cover the following topics: security principles as they relate to cybersecurity, risk assessments and some of the common ways to determine risk, current measures such as authentication, authorization, and access control, organizational weakness as they relate to vulnerabilities in people, policies, and technologies, identify attack vectors and analysis. We will also talk about attribution analysis and some of the challenges involved with that, review the vulnerability assessment report, and finally provide key recommendations. Security principles are the building blocks of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, also known as the CIA triad. Security principles are used to provide guidelines and standards through governance, protection, detection, and response. Governance by identifying and managing security risks. Protection by implementing security controls to reduce security risks. Detection by detecting and understanding cybersecurity events. And finally, responding to and recovering from cybersecurity incidents. The Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, requires government agencies to implement an information security program that effectively manages risk. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, called the NIST, is a non-regulatory agency that has issued specific guidelines for complying with FISMA. Some of the FISMA requirements include maintaining and inventorying of information systems, categorizing information in information systems into risk levels, maintaining a system security plan, implementing security controls based off of NIST 800 TAC 53, conducting risk assessments, and finally conducting continuous monitoring after those have been implemented. Now moving on to risk. Risk is defined as a probability of likelihood of a threat exploiting a particular vulnerability and the impact that it has on an organization. A common formula used to describe risk is equal to threat times vulnerability times consequence. The threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to harm an information system through unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, modification of data, and/or denial of service. Threats could arise from human actions and/or natural events. A vulnerability is a weakness in an information system, system security procedure, internal control, or implementation that could be exploited or triggered by a threat source. Consequences are all negative impacts that result from an incident. Now to move on to risk assessment. A risk assessment identifies assets such as hardware, software, systems, laptops, computer data, and intellectual property, and then identifies the various risks that could affect those assets using qualitative and quantitative methodologies. The quantitative approach is based on objective measures. Cost and benefits issues are important. It requires a large amount of historical data such as threat frequencies, likelihood, etc. It is more complex than the qualitative approach and involves mathematical tools and is best suited for technical and security staff. The qualitative approach is also results-based, but it's more subjective. Monetary value and threat frequency are less important. The process is straightforward and does not require a need for mathematical tools. This approach is more suited for non-security staff. Now to move on to current measures. The first current measure we will talk about is authentication. Authentication is the act of validating users that request access to a system, network, or device. There are several different authentication types, 3 of which we will talk about today. The first is password-based authentication, which is a process that involves a user inputting a unique set of credentials such as username and password that are then checked against stored credentials. The second is multi-factor authentication, which requires that a user provide at least 2 pieces of evidence to prove their identity. This is usually a combination of something you know, something that you have, or something that you are. Something that you know could be a code, PIN, or password. Something that you have could be a bracelet, ID, key fob, mobile device, or token. And something that you are could be a fingerprint, retina pattern, voice, or face. Lastly is digital certificate authentication, which is the use of digital certificates to identify a user, machine, or device before granting access to a resource, network, or application. Now moving on to the second current measure. The second current measure is authorization. Authorization is the process by which a server determines if the client has permission to use a resource or access a file after they have been authenticated. Two prominent ways to control authorization is through permissions and policies. Permissions determine the type of access others have to data, shared folders, and resources across the network. Policies are the set of standards or behaviors for activities such as encryption of email activities and restrictions of the use of social media. Now moving on to the third current measure. The third current measure is access controls, which are safeguards used to reduce the chances that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. This process involves restricting access or granting permissions that will allow someone to do something such as access, read, write, delete, or modify files. Access control components include authentication, authorization, access, managing, and auditing. Access control types includes role-based access, mandatory access controls, discretionary access controls, and physical and logical access controls. Role-based access controls control access and permissions based on users' role, functions, position, or department they operate in within an organization. Mandatory access controls is non-discretionary and is simply based on the decision of a central authority such as the security administrator. Discretionary access controls enables a file or system owner to control, grant, limit others' permissions. Physical and logical control examples include physical access cards, fobs, tokens, locks, and keys, as well as a security guard with an access control list. Some of the logical controls include login credentials, PINs, one-time passwords, virtual private networks, biometric readers, and digital authentication certificates, and digital keys. Now to move on to security weaknesses and people, technology, and policies. Security weakness and policy. Policies are rules, principles, guidelines, and frameworks that are adopted or designed by an organization to achieve its security or business goals. Some of the common weaknesses that we'll find in policies are poorly written policies or underdeveloped policies. Lack of relevant policies to protect the organization, such as technical, administrative, or legal, limited flexibilities in policies or policies that are too broad, out-of-date policies, policies that are not enforced, or the lack of audit controls for policies. Security weaknesses in technology. Technology is the methods, systems, and devices which are used to accomplish objectives. Common weaknesses include design flaws, using end-of-life cycle software and hardware, misconfigurations, both system and network, improper hardware access, open systems, switch, and hardware ports, port security, lack of redundancy, and fault tolerance. Security weakness in people. Common weaknesses include lack of security in computer training, lack of oversight, principles of least privilege not applied, internal and external malicious actors, lack of audit control for policies, unaware mistakes, or organizational culture effects. Now to talk about attack vectors. An attack vector is a pathway or method used by a hacker to illegally access a network or computer to exploit system vulnerabilities. There are two types of attacks, active and passive. An active attack vector exploits and attempts to alter a system or affect its operation using malware, exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities, email spoofing, man-in-the-middle attacks, domain hijacking, and ransomware, to name a few. Passive attacks or passive attacks vectors exploits are attempts to gain access or to make use from the system but does not affect the system resource, such as typo squatting, phishing, and other social engineering based attacks. Attribution analysis. Cyber attribution is the process of tracking, identifying, and laying blame on the perpetrator of a cyber attack or cyber incident. Proven attribution may be difficult due to the many ways malicious actors attempt to hide what they are doing. Three other ways is through obscurity, obliteration, or internal confusion. Obscurity is deliberately hiding or concealing their techniques and methods by using spoof IP addresses, MAC addresses, or captured traffic packets. They also use anonymizers such as Tor browser and other techniques to mask the information about the attacker or the systems used. The second is through obliteration techniques. The attacker may modify, delete, and destroy logs to cover its tracks. And finally is the use of internal confusion. Attackers take evasions a step further by intentionally leaving the crime scene a confusing mess that is hard to untangle or leads to investigators down rabbit holes to nowhere. These are just a few ways that attackers are able to circumvent being caught. This also makes it extremely hard to attribute a cyber incident to a person, state, or country. Careful consideration has to be made when considering attribution, as this can have political ramifications if a country or group is wrongfully accused. Attribution attack analysis is analyzing and identifying tactics, techniques, and procedures used by attackers to develop a unique fingerprint that identifies a group's activities. In short, it is used to conduct further analysis regarding known attack vectors and potentially associate these attack vectors with an actor. The chart presented on the slide displays information of different attack vectors, provides descriptions, and provides goals of each attack. Having this information not only allows us to be aware of an attack vectors, but also allows us to plan for risk management purposes. Vulnerability Assessment Matrix. The ISO IEC 27000-2018 standard defines a vulnerability as a weakness of an asset or control that can be exploited by one or more threats. The vulnerability assessment involves conducting initial assessments, system baseline definitions, gathering information, conducting vulnerability scans. Now to take a deeper look at each one of these. Initial assessments is identifying the organization's context and assets and defining the risk and critical value for each business process and IT system. System baselines involves gathering information about the organization before the vulnerability assessment, i.e., organization structure, current configurations, software and hardware versions. Vulnerability scan is the use of available and approved tools and techniques to identify the vulnerabilities and attempt to exploit them. And finally, vulnerability assessment reporting is a summary of findings, including name and description of vulnerability, score, potential impact, and recommended mitigation. We will see more about this on slide 15. The vulnerability assessment matrix shows some of the specific types of attack vectors from the risk assessment created earlier in the process, which was used to rank and categorize each attack vector qualitatively, meaning low, medium, and high, followed by remediation approaches listed in the mitigation column. Most of these vulnerabilities are attributed to third-party software vendors who have vulnerabilities within their software, improper configuration, and lack of training. Requiring vendors to provide patches, implementing configuration and control management, and providing relevant training will greatly reduce the number of vulnerabilities present. Key recommendations. Once the risks are ranked, they can be prioritized for mitigation. Although it is not possible to mitigate or eliminate all risks, the key recommendations are made based on the goal of reducing risk to an acceptable or tolerable level and within budget. Risk mitigation is the process of planning for disasters and having a way to lessen the impact. We will be talking about 4 different risk management strategies. The first is risk acceptance strategy, which can involve collaboration between team members to identify the possible risks but not taking any action. This is the riskiest option because it involves doing nothing to mitigate or control the problem or vulnerability. The second is risk avoidance strategy, which involves planning for the risk and then taking steps to avoid it. An example of this is using the POAM framework that involves detailing resources required to accomplish the elements of the plan, milestones for meeting the tasks, and a schedule for completion dates for the milestones. The third is risk control strategy, which works by taking into account risks identified and accepted, and then taking actions to reduce or eliminate the impacts of the risk. The NIST Risk Management Framework provides a comprehensive 7-step process that is used to manage information security and privacy risks for organizations. It also supports implementation of risk management programs to meet the requirements of the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, also known as FISMA. The 7-step process involves preparing all essentials. First, preparing all essentials to prepare the organization to manage security. The second is categorizing the system and information processed, stored, and transmitted based on the impact analysis. The third is selecting the set of NIST SV 800 TAC 53 controls to protect the system based on risk assessment. Fourth is implementing the controls and documents how controls are deployed. The fifth is assessing to determine if the controls are in place, operating as intended, and producing the desired results. The sixth is achieving risk-based decision through senior management. And finally, the seventh is continuously monitoring controls and implementations and risks to all the systems. Finally, the last risk management strategy is the transferring of risk. The transferring of risk strategy works by transferring the strain of risk and consequences to another party. This strategy creates an additional expense for the asset holder. It comes with the limited coverage, and additional coverage may cost additional funding. The company to which risk is being transferred needs to be proven and reputable before selecting. At the summit, the key recommendations of implementing risk control and mitigation strategies will foster a safe communication and will help to protect networks and data from risk and attacks while at the 5i Summit. This concludes the brief.